Okay, this time this whole electronic thing started to work. We're starting the conversation about nutrients, and part of it is going to be, I believe, pretty interesting discussions about nutritional studies and clinical implications of, different diets. Part of it will be physiology of nutrition. It's not a nutrition class, so I'm going to focus more about, how the organism physiologically responds to different types of diets. We have 3 energy-bearing nutrients: carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Okay, sugars, fats, and proteins. We have other nutrients which are not energy-bearing, but still essential: vitamins, certain minerals. By minerals, I don't mean that you're munching on a piece of chalk, but I'm referring to ions. And water, of course. Now, nutrient advice changes constantly. I'm not reading. It's a very much understatement. Now, by nutrient advice, I want to make it very clear. I'm talking about the nutrient advice from more or less reliable sources, not Dr. Oz. Nutrient advice is generated mainly by FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So Food and Drug Administration initially produced this pyramid of consumption, which placed various types of whole grains, like bread, potatoes, and plant oils at the bottom. Then there were various kinds of vegetables and fruits, legumes and nuts, fish and poultry, milk and cheese, all kinds of dairy stuff, and for some interesting reason FDA placed white rice and white bread into the same category as red meat and butter. So the presumption was that consuming low-fat diet, and if you look at this pyramid, you can clearly see that highest fat content, except for the plant oils, but come on, you're not going to be drinking olive oil by glasses, so we're talking about a couple teaspoons. Most fat-bearing nutrients will be concentrated on top of the pyramid. Does that make sense? That pyramid represents what we know as low-fat diet. Right? In 1997, in a manuscript published by Hewitt and some other folks, it was suggested that saturated fats, it was suggested based on certain clinical observations, that saturated fats are associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. That was basically an underlying, and it was suggested before, don't get me wrong, it's not just 1997. And that was the foundation for the nutritional advice generated by FDA, that we all should stick to low-fat diets, and that idea that fats are associated with heart attacks was the culprit in all those fat-free foods that you can still see in the grocery stores now. And everybody remembers the height of it, when you could not find, normal yogurt or buttermilk. They always reduced fat or fat-free. At the same time, interestingly enough, the United States were overwhelmed with the obesity epidemic. And later some folks, clinical folks, started to challenge the idea that consumption of fat is associated with cardiovascular disease. One of the bases of this was Framingham study. It's a really interesting experiment that was done in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. It's not what you think, it's not zombie apocalypse, no. It was pretty cool because that's a relatively small town, and all residents of that town were observed, clinically observed, from 1975 or something like that. Every year, all medical data was stored and used and analyzed. So basically, scientists, doctors, had an opportunity to see how people get old, people grow, okay, how they develop diseases, and people reported on what they eat, how they, do they exercise, do they not exercise. And this gave scientists a pretty good body of evidence that in fact, and a lot of other clinical studies showed, that in fact the consumption of saturated fat does not increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. As you can imagine, it is true only, to a certain extent. If you will switch to a diet that completely consists of butter, and you will eat, 2 packs of butter every day, not only your heart will give up, your liver will give up, your blood vessels, they will give up. We're talking about, people who like meat, dairy, cheese, all that kind of stuff. So, the most recent data on the consumption of saturated fats and the risk for cardiovascular disease demonstrated that, and I want to be very clear about it, dietary saturated fats, dietary, meaning the ones that are consumed with the diet, have no impact on the risk to develop cardiovascular disease. Okay? Now, much more important factor that is not on this page, but just letting you know, is association of diabetes with the risk of cardiovascular disease. And there are, in fact, multiple studies showing that elevated blood sugar leads to vascular inflammation, vascular dysfunction, eventually may lead to increased chances for atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? If you think about what typical Western diet consists of, it consists largely of processed foods. And processed foods contain a lot of carbohydrates. And not just carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, which require minimal energy to get processed, elevate blood glucose significantly, and that elevated blood glucose eventually leads to the development of type 2 diabetes. So more and more clinical observations suggest that it's not saturated fat that actually causes cardiovascular disease, but more of the combination of sedentary lifestyle, consumption of processed food that contains a large proportion of simple carbohydrates, and our low-fat diet, as it seems now, contributed dramatically to the obesity epidemic in the United States. Imagine that your food is 100%, and 10% of your food is fat. If you take this 10% out completely, the content of every other component will automatically increase, right? You understand what I'm saying? If, say, your carbohydrates were at 45, they now half of the food. So, essentially, fats, in order to make food palatable, were replaced, one way or another, by carbohydrates. And more researchers now suggest that actually it was a very ill-advised move to develop the pyramid like that, so that we eat a lot of carbohydrates in the diet and rarely eat lipids and proteins. Because proteins are what? Full proteins. Fish and poultry, dairy, and meat. Does that make sense? Moreover, it was ill-advised because when obesity epidemic started to be noticeable, the main approach was, okay, we're going to feed people with, low-fat diet, high carbohydrate, low-fat. We're going to control the calories, and they're going to get leaner. The main problem is that on high carbohydrate diet, it's really hard to control the calories, not because you don't know how much you eat, but because you're hungry. Because carbohydrates get digested, absorbed, and used very quickly, and you feel hungry again. And multiple clinical studies suggested that high fat or high protein, or both, low carbohydrate diet that is non-energy restricted, meaning you don't have to count calories, is equal to energy restricted low fat diet in terms of the weight loss. Meaning if you don't go insane and eat, I don't know, 5 pounds of nuts in a dinner, or I don't know, you don't eat entire cow, so you consume normal amount of food, you don't feel overextended, let's put it this way, okay, then eating diet that is rich in proteins and fats, but fairly low in carbohydrates, will help you to control your weight just as efficiently or better as the energy restricted, calorie restricted high carb diet. Yes.
It's like the Atkins diet of the
Sort of, yeah.
I've been on that. It's like a carb control diet where you can only have max of like 20, I think, grams of carbohydrates every day, and it's really nuts.
It is. So it's really hard because when it comes down to control, I believe it makes people like absolute maniacs in the worst sense of that word. Okay, it is when you do high-fat diet and you control your energy consumption, it is super efficient. But look, it's impossible to sustainably control, I mean quantitatively control the amount of calories that you take in. This is why it's so important that it can be non-energy restricted diet. But you have to be well aware of what you are eating. Which food is rich in fat, which food is rich in carbohydrates, which food is rich in proteins. Does that make sense? So that's number one. It looks like high-fat diet is better in terms of the controlling body weight. Okay? So that's another publication from there. Now, what about downsides? Elevated dietary fats may lead to unfavorable change in low-density lipoprotein cholesterol. So basically, there's good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Heard about it? So low-density lipoprotein is bad. So if you're really focusing on eating a lot of fat, saturated fat, then your low-density lipoproteins may increase. As we will see later, it turns out that it is more important to observe the ratio between the good and the bad, and not just bad cholesterol itself. Okay? That make sense? And of course, the better the compliance with the diet, the greater the benefits are. I don't want to say that it's an ultimate savior for all of us, and we should, and everybody agrees on that. There are people that vehemently oppose the idea of high-fat diet. They call it a new hype, sort of. And there are certain metabolic changes that look, well, I would say interesting. And let's be honest and let's be, absolutely transparent here. Nobody did a complete long-term evaluation of the high-fat diet. By long-term, I mean not just years, maybe dozens of years, on, say, cardiovascular health. From what we know in experiments in animals, high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet may actually improve vascular function, and it definitely improves insulin sensitivity in mice with diabetes. But still, no long-term evaluations of health implications have been done. Does that make sense? We'll get back to the idea of high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet later. Now this is the new plate. which still contains, honestly, very little protein and very little fat. And we'll talk about, whether it's good for you to drink milk or not. Spoiler alert, it's good, even if you're an adult. But we're going to talk about it later. Any questions? Know your nutrients, as you will see pretty soon. Carbohydrates. This will harken back to our conversation about digestion and absorption. Remember, we talked about breakdown of carbohydrates in the intestine? They're broken down to monosaccharides. Okay? So your cells can use glucose directly in aerobic respiration. Okay? Galactose is converted to glucose. Liver can do it. And fructose, that's an interesting story. Fructose bypasses the glucose step. Does that make sense? So this a lot of foods produced specifically for people with diabetes, instead of regular sugar, which is basically glucose and fructose. I mean, sugar. Sugar, it's two monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. Those diabetic foods contain fructose only. And fructose can be directly processed to generate glycogen and triglycerides in the liver. Have you heard the term high fructose corn syrup? Consumption of high fructose corn syrup, I mean massive consumption of high fructose corn syrup, is heavily associated with increased risk for fatty liver disease and in general increased risk of obesity. Okay, but there's a pretty solid lobby in the United States. I believe high fructose corn syrup is produced from corn, as its name suggests, and corn lobby is pretty powerful, and they don't want any action on controlling its presence in the food. Okay. So what's the functions? Energy, of course, first and foremost. They used for synthesis of nucleic acids and glycosylation of macromolecules such as proteins and lipids. Now, what constitutes low versus high carbohydrate? Pick a manuscript, pick a clinical study, and they will all define it slightly different in terms of the numbers. There's no consensus. Generally speaking, if we're talking about 2,000 calories a day, high carbohydrate diet, when you consume about half of your calories from carbohydrates. Does that make sense? Low carbohydrate diet is when you consume 10 to 30% of all your calories from carbohydrates. It's hard. Low carbohydrate diet is hard, especially if you like beer. It's almost impossible. Now, you may have heard the term of glycemic index. Have you? No? To be honest, I don't really remember the whole formula for calculation of that glycemic index. But it's basically how much certain product containing carbohydrates will increase your blood glucose over a certain period of time. So sugar, for instance, like granulated sugar, has extremely high glycemic index because it goes almost directly into the bloodstream. Does that make sense? All that same stuff applies for, soda or cakes, anything sweetened. And then we have products with low glycemic index, which contain a lot of complex carbohydrates, whole grains, and like brown rice. Potatoes are kind of in the middle. White rice has pretty high glycemic index, but beans, for instance, have low. Okay? Meaning that the elevation of blood sugar will be fairly moderate when you consume those products, because it takes a lot of time to digest them, to break them down. Does that make sense to you? So if you focus on controlling the blood glucose for some reason, or you're focusing on just controlling your carbohydrate intake, you should always focus on the products with low glycemic index. Obviously, butter has the lowest glycemic index possible. It has no carbohydrates whatsoever. Or, well, meat is complicated, okay? But let's be fair, you know, if you would offer a normal person, like in terms of food, boiled lentils versus a slice of cake looks much more attractive. And that's the problem with processed foods, because they have a lot of simple carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates not only make them bad, they also make them more palatable. That makes sense? Tasty. And it's sort of a trivial now, but there are multiple observational studies showing that processed foods are preferred because they taste better. Okay? Hands down. Does that make sense? Pizza does taste awesome. But it's technically, if it's not like homemade, even if it's homemade, it's bread. So, kind of processed food. Yes?
So, a question. So, if a kid only eats the chicken nuggets and that's the only thing they prefer, is that like a risk factor?
You have to look at the composition of chicken nuggets. And it is processed food. Basically, one of the greatest advices that I've heard about diet, if your food looks very close to its source, it's good. So, you know, like if you buy a chicken breast in the store, you can definitely see, you know, it being a part of a chicken. Yeah, you cook it, but it's minimally processed. When I look at chicken nuggets, they don't look like chicken, like original one that was running in the yard, you know. So that's the idea. Like bread doesn't look much like the grains that it was made from. So the farther it is from the source, the more it is processed, the less, probably the less nutritious it is. But we'll talk about components. Go ahead.
Is there a difference between if I buy bread from the store versus if I make it? Is it like same components?
Yeah, well, store will add some tricks like amylase. Remember the enzyme? Amylase? That amylase to, it's benign, absolutely benign. But amylase, a little bitty bit of amylase that they add to the dough makes it really, really fluffy. So if you don't have, I mean, unless you speed in the bread, which I hope you don't. Yeah. But except for like an hour of mixing stuff, I don't think, you know, it's just easier to buy it in the store.
So that's why they want you, or they encourage you to get like that whole grain bread that has like the bits of the like grains, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's less processed. Less processed food, yeah. And I don't know, when I was a kid, I tried to munch on, I think it was barley, like actual barley, like the thing of a barley. It's tasteless. It's just nothing.
Is that why you like beer?
No, I don't think so. It's a learned habit. I went to college, so that explains a lot. So what happens if you don't have enough carbohydrates? Well, tissue wasting, your muscles are not going to grow. If you exclude carbohydrates from the diet, forget about muscle growth. You're going to have metabolic acidosis. Is it bad? Not really. Because your brain learns how to work in the conditions when glucose is really, really low, okay? And actually your neurons can use ketones. Huh? Yeah, you feel like shit. That is absolutely true. But I can tell you this. I mean, we're gonna come back to this example, but those of anyone did long distance running. Have you heard about carb loading? So the idea is you cut your carbs completely for a week, and then on Friday you eat a massive pasta dinner, and on Saturday you're ready for the race. The problem is, yeah, you're gonna increase your glycogen storage for a bit, but you're gonna run out of it at some point. I mean, maybe you will have enough for the race, or maybe not. And when you're done with glycogen, you're going to start using fat and you hit the wall. And you just want to die. So if you're running 5K, you're probably not going to run out of glycogen. If you run 10K, probably not. Half marathon, it depends. Marathon, you need to run really, really fast to make it. But still, there's a pretty real risk of hitting the wall. If you're running ultra, I'm talking 24-hour races. Yeah. Oh yeah, there are people do 24-hour races. They do like 24. I believe they do like there's a woman. I think she's from. No, she's not from Ohio, but she's from States. I believe she's from States. She did. So 10 minutes a mile, something like 140 or 150 mile in 24.
How do you stay awake for that?
Are you just running?
Keep running.
You keep running.
How do you not get bored?
Well, so yeah, people do like, a buddy of mine did 100K, I personally did 50 mile, so it's doable. But the point is, you're gonna run out of glycogen. Okay? Some people use gels, carbohydrates. But think about this. It takes time to process. Okay? It takes time just to process carbohydrate. So unless you meticulously time the consumption of these gels, and you really have to experiment with yourself. So you need to know if you hit the wall at the mile 18, you really need to start eating those gels at the mile 4. I learned it the hard way. Okay? So you have to do you have to be proactive here. So what some ultra runners said to hell with it. We're not going to deal with carbs. So they go in ketosis, complete ketosis. They cut carbs all along. So they don't need carbs during the race because their muscles and their brain operate on ketones that they generate by burning fat. And it's really hard to burn all the fat, even during an ultra. Okay? So there are some ultra runners that run in ketosis, which is a shitty experience, to be honest. Okay? Because as Justin said, you do feel like trash. Now, fats. 2 types in the diet: saturated, unsaturated. Saturated in the animal products like meats and dairy. I mean, poultry and fish. Well, poultry is saturated. Fish is unsaturated, basically. Oils. Okay, so when you buy oil, whether it's sunflower, blah 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 blah, canola, vegetable, anything, it's unsaturated fat. Unsaturated, FYI, I don't think I asked it on the exam. It is called unsaturated because it contains double bonds between carbons. That's what makes it liquid. Saturated fat is butter, animal fat. Okay? Trans fats. You take that was really terrible idea. Well, not terrible. So obviously, if you think about it, butter, animal products are more expensive than plant products. It's much easier to produce enormous amount of corn and make oil out of it, right? Than to produce cows to make equal amount of butter. So there was an idea. Okay, what about how can we make a cheap substitution of butter but using plant oils? How about we're gonna hydrogenate them? It's a chemical process which saturates double bonds in the oils, turning them solid. That's vegetable shortening or margarine. Okay? Make sense? It's originally plant oils that are chemically modified, and now they are not liquid, they're solid. Does that make sense? And then there's cholesterol. A lot of it is in egg yolk, a lot of it. Okay. And we'll talk about cholesterol as well. Some in meat, some in butter. It's fine. Okay. Now, component called linoleic acid is essential for synthesis of lecithin. We have to obtain it with food. We obtain it from the plant sources mostly. Now, functions, energy, first and foremost. Okay, supply for muscles, skeletal muscles and liver are pretty good at breaking down lipids for energy. Lipids can be stored in adipose tissue, effective energy storage. You have something to lose in the time of hunger. And a lot of second line functions like fat-soluble vitamin absorption, synthesis of phospholipids, synthesis of certain inflammation-related molecules like eicosanoids. Okay, so a lot of it is important. But first and foremost, of course, lipids carry energy supporting function. Now, there are recommendations produced by FDA that fats can constitute no more than 30% of daily caloric intake, saturated fat no more than 10, and cholesterol should be kept at under 300 milligrams per day. You know what these recommendations are based on? Nothing. Those are, well, let me explain what I mean. When somebody has HIV and goes to the doctor, what does the doctor tell this person? Here's the drug. HIV, here's the drug. And you know why? Because we tried this drug, we tested this drug, we know how this drug works, and it's going to help you. So this medical advice to treat HIV with this drug is based on the experience. You know, doctor doesn't prescribe kombucha and acupuncture because that, well, some do, I suppose, but they're not doctors. But, you know, this is called evidence-based medicine. That makes sense? For instance, now, that's a bit digression. Now, if you will go to a physician who reads the special literature and you say, I have an ear infection, what you're going to get most likely is the answer like this. The physician will look down your ear and say, yes, you do have an ear infection. It does look like a bacterial ear infection. Here's the prescription, but don't fill it up yet. Go home. Wait for 2-3 days. You're going to get better. If you don't get better, then go to the pharmacy, fill up the prescription, start taking drugs. Because most recent studies show that antibiotics are marginally effective in treating ear infections. This is called evidence-based medicine. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is that why doctors are breaking down on like antibacterial?
Sorry, say it one more time.
Is that why doctors' offices are breaking, like, not giving out so many antibiotics and everything because people are getting like prone to it?
Well, they don't give so much antibiotic because the more antibiotics you give to people, the more antibiotic resistance you induce in bacteria. So it's basically, let's wait and see what's going to happen. Yes.
When they ask you how long you've had the symptoms, I've noticed like if it's past like 10 days, like a week and a half,
Most likely, yeah.
then they'll give it to you.
Because viral infection, there are two outcomes. You're going to get better, you're going to die. If you're still alive and it's 10 days past, it's not virus. Now, here's the deal. So these recommendations made by FDA, they were opinions of doctors. respectable doctors, but those were opinions based on, bless you, based on zero clinical evidence. And think about this, like there is no difference in the risk of cardiovascular disease between people who deliberately avoid saturated fats and people who normally include dairy and meat products in their diet. Does that make sense? So saturated fats are fine. Now a little word about different oils. Canola, vegetable, sunflower, olive, grapeseed, and blah blah blah. You may have noticed that all these oils have very different price tag on them. And in many cases, you can see advertisements, really penetrating advertisements, suggesting olive oil is just so much better than everything else, or grapeseed, which costs like some astronomical numbers. Yeah, for that much, yeah. So you almost think that you need to apply it topically. Yeah. There is no evidence that, and they all contain the same fatty acids, same unsaturated fatty acids, in slightly different proportions, because they come from different sources. There is no evidence whatsoever that one oil is better than another oil in terms of reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease. Does that make sense? So, if you like the taste of olive oil, sure. If you look at the oil as, a substitute or, just healthy option, you don't have to go bonkers and, pay $15 for a little bottle of grapeseed oil. There's no point in it. Canola oil will work just fine. Okay. Here we go to trans fats. So I know the manuscript where I stole those pictures from. Well, I'd rather say I borrowed, yeah, because I reference. I put reference. I didn't ask the guy if I can use, but I don't think he's going to be really against it. So this is unsaturated acid, okay, oleic acid that can be found in oils, all right? Does that make sense? So what we do, we expose some of those acids to hydrogenation, and suddenly they form this. So this bond, any organic chemistry aficionado may marvel at this. It's called cis double bonds, meaning that these branches are on the same side of the bond. I'm not going to ask this. I'm not Dr. Roskas. These branches are on the opposite sides from the double bond. So this is why it's called trans fat. So this enormous list was produced. I don't remember what year that paper was. My little excerpt doesn't say it. That's a lot, actually, Like fries, fish burger, chicken nuggets, enchilada, burrito, packaged snacks. Now, look at this. The first set, it's fast or frozen foods. Second set is packaged snacks. This set is bakery products. So this is all processed foods. Does that make sense? And many of them are packaged, and trans fats, they cheaper, and they sometimes easier to cook with, and they make them more palatable. Well, guess what? Trans fats are strongly associated in every clinical study. Trans fats are strongly increasing risk of cardiovascular disease in people. Okay? So, for instance, if you look at this graph, it's very awkward parameter. Basically, what was done, trans fats replaced certain type of other fats in the diet. And then scientists looked at the ratio of total cholesterol to HDL. So basically, total cholesterol is all your cholesterol that you have, right? HDL is the good one. So you want this ratio to be low. You want almost all your cholesterol to be good one, HDL, right? That makes sense? No. What I'm saying, like total over HDL, right? So if your HDL is high, this ratio will be low. Understand what I'm saying? So, what they saw, if they replace any fat with trans fat, this ratio starts to increase. It increases the most if you replace unsaturated fats, basically oils, with trans fats. That makes sense? They saw basically the same when they broke it down into low density, or bad as Aaron referenced to it, and high density cholesterol. When you replace saturated or unsaturated fats, normal, regular fats or oils, with trans fat, the levels of bad cholesterol rise. To a different degree, but they still rise. And when you replace levels of quality, high density cholesterol, they become lower and lower. Now, that is molecular approach. That's just, shows you the changes in some of the molecules that can be found in the blood when you start to eat more trans fat and less, oils and fats. So all in all, trans fats are heavily associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And I can tell you this, when I buy stuff, and yes, my wife praises American food industry. When we had 3 men in the household, 2 teenagers and me, she praised American food industry for development of what we call in the family a bachelor's chow. Meatballs, frozen meatballs. You buy like 5-pound bag and it lasts for a week. And if, so we can warm them up, there's food, okay? Just she works as well, and it's not always enough time to cook something, okay? Now, we stopped buying them because we looked at the nutrition panel. Trans fats. That's probably the only thing that I'm really concerned about in the food, okay? So, trying to answer Marina's question, look at the nutrition thing. If it says trans fats, no. If it shows trans fat 0, sure. In Europe, as far as I know, Europe banned trans fats in the food altogether. In the United States, I don't think they're banned all over, but since general public became more aware of the risks associated with the trans fats, food manufacturers, they moved towards limiting that component. Does that make sense? We're going to stop right